Good morning, world. This is Steve Rao, the host of Pod TV's World Edition. And on Pod TV, we bring you great news from around the world on this show, World Edition. My name is Steve Rao. I'm the host of the show. Getting my lighting right. There you go. And on this show, we talk about innovation, global affairs, what we can do to build back better and stronger. Today, I'm going to begin my monologue with a continuation of a conversation we had yesterday, but to honor the life of George Floyd. We all remember where we were when we saw on this day a year ago George Floyd, a son, a father, a black man in Minneapolis, who lost his life in front of the world with an 8-second chokehold. I got emotional as I heard the last few gasps of breath when he called for his late mother, saying, "I can't breathe." Here we are a year later. How has the world changed since George Floyd? And what can we learn from his life and the tragic events that have unfolded? Well, first of all, let's just look at a couple of things before I talk about some interesting work that I'm doing in this area. Protests happened in all cities in America, even rural areas. People were protesting with one message: Black Lives Matter. Confederate statues and monuments connected to the Civil War are continuing to be taken down. Police officers, like Derek Chauvin, were charged with murder, and others are following suit. Police departments have made changes. In Minneapolis, they banned chokeholds, and President Biden has actually proposed the George Floyd Policing Act, federal legislation that changes the way we do law enforcement. Even some street names have changed, and many charities and companies are donating to these causes. But the most important thing is more people are speaking out against racism and having a conversation on why racism exists and why racial bias exists. Which leads me to my final point. The most important thing I think we can look at is the policies that we incorporate. The policies that we incorporate in our own local communities to develop what I call anti-racist policies, but to have a comfortable conversation. Today, 13% of black men are incarcerated in prisons. 40% of black Americans own homes. The data clearly shows that many of these communities have been disenfranchised in blighted neighborhoods and have not had the access to education that they need to pursue the American dream. I close out today with just a task force report that I was involved in for the North Carolina League of Municipalities. This task force basically brought together cities, this task force from all across North Carolina, to come up with policies in our own cities and towns that could address racism and provide inclusive communities that stand for justice and equality. I'm going to just read out a couple of the recommendations for you. First, the report's recommendations are cities and towns must consider examination of their own historical practices related to redlining and other policies that have harmed homeownership. Cities and towns can afford to do so by providing incentives that encourage investment in redline neighborhoods. Cities and towns can consider targeted approaches and strategies such as universalism to address inequities created by past policies. Cities and towns make investments in social infrastructure like parks and libraries and provide equal access to these facilities for anyone, regardless of their color or their skin. Cities and towns can consider assessments of their policing that examine approaches to racial equity. Cities and towns can create spaces and forums for brave conversations, conversations often with those who don't look like us, who don't agree with us. And finally, we can establish education and training opportunities for city and town officials to establish a shared common understanding and language to have dialogue at a local level. I could go on, but my point is this: policies and conversation is how we can deal with this disease of bias and hatred and racism that exists in our society. No vaccine, no shot can cure this problem. We cannot diagnose it on a medical exam. But when we catch cancer early, we can cure it. When we catch a disease early, we can cure it. The good news, The George Floyd event and his life on this earth has actually forced us to have a more serious conversation and a more serious diagnosis of the problem. Now it's time for solutions. I'm wearing a purple shirt today to show that we need to come together as Republicans and Democrats to tackle this issue. And my gold tie is representing the fact that in this darkness, we can see the light. And the light is hope and equality for all Americans, which can be an inspiration to millions around the world that in this nation, we truly are the land of the free and land of the brave, and that we all are created equal. Thank you. And now I'm going to be joined with Mark Lee and Sasha Starr, and that was my opening monologue. Thank you. Better than yesterday. Thank you.
Steve, may I ask you a question, please?
Sure.
There's so much being shown and known about last 9 minutes of life. We saw it all several times on TV. But you cannot judge a man and build up a mythology using only 9 minutes, last 9 minutes of the man's life. Could you tell us more about his life prior to that? Who he was, what he was standing for? Tell me, please. I am not so knowledgeable about that.
Mark, could you take a stab at that? Because I don't know as much about him as I should. But Mark, you know a little bit about him, right?
I mean, the reason he became a figure, and I mean, I think that's coming. Some of the point that Sasha is making is because of what happened in his last few minutes of his life and the way that he was handled and treated. Because definitely a lot of times that's the way folks feel about police violence throughout the country and everything. But in terms of who he was a working class individual. He did not have a lot of fame or a lot of knowledge in terms of being known in that community outside of this incident. So like I said, he was definitely a working class individual. There is some speculation that he might have had some background in some of the criminal element as well, but that's not even totally clear and all of that. But definitely it's because of how his life ended. And I mean, we can say that about a lot of famous people, Sasha. I mean, would we really know Paul Revere, if not for what happened to Paul Revere in his life and everything toward the latter part of his life, if we want to look at historical figures and anything of that nature? I mean, not everybody can be a Kennedy, because Kennedy did a lot of things during his presidency. Well, of course, the reason we know him, a lot of people know him, is also because of the assassination. And the same with Martin Luther King, who did a lot of great things in terms of being a civil rights leader. So was he involved in the civil rights movement? Was he involved in BLM? No. So like I said, it was because of so you may say that he was in some ways a martyr to the cause. And we've seen that throughout history and throughout the world, that sometimes somebody's fame is because of how their life was ended or how things happened, and then they became a martyr to the cause.
By the way, we very well spoke about Kennedy, Mark, because he was a philanderer and drug addict also, just like George Floyd. But I don't think George Floyd was actually a philanderer. He had drug issues, but he wasn't with every woman in town like John F. Kennedy does. And what you're saying is correct. That's irrelevant to what happened in those 9 minutes. Okay, and that was a real problem. But he had petty crime issues, what I call petty crime, which is like, drug issues and things of that nature. But nothing that I saw that was violent or nothing that was felonious. And so that's the real problem. He's like every body, and also what they're addressing is the over-policing in America, which I just got my criminal citation the other day from an over-policing animal control person, which I'm going to go to court on and demonstrate the overreach that this person had in North Carolina. But Mark, I can see that that's upsetting to people, and rightfully so. I call it over-policing, and even the neighborhood which I sit on the board with, there's a lot of over-policing here too. In other words, it's almost like for whatever reason, they want to, what I call over-police, as opposed to do what they're supposed to do, is protect and serve. But there's another issue that really bugs me that isn't being brought out. Okay, the media loves George Floyd because of its egregious act. But here's what happened this weekend that the media glances over. This is in Chicago. 54 people were shot this weekend in Chicago. 12 were fatally shot. Okay, and it's being ignored. Why? Because there's no racial or police issue that the media can attract. Yet, if you think about it, that's 12 George Floyds out there that just got murdered, and 54 people got shot, and the media glances over it because there's no storyline they can attach to it to excite people.
So, Nick, you're saying that in Chicago, which is the Windy City and definitely has a large black population, that out of these, I think you said it was 54, that a large population or a large portion of those were not African American or Latin American or minority?
I don't know, because that wasn't mentioned. I'm not really sure, but I'm just saying that I'm not sure the racial composition of the 54 people that are being shot and the 12 people that got killed. But what I'm saying is that that should be a storyline that should be followed, Mark. And the thing is, if you want to devote resources, why don't you devote resources to this? Because if you look at numerically, that's 12 George Floyds, right? And that's just this weekend. And that happens like every weekend in Chicago. And it's like we brush it over because why are their lives don't matter? Talk to me, guys. Why do these 12 people who died in Chicago?
Well, if I can add to that, I mean, I know here in Durham, we oftentimes keep track of how many people have been shot and killed, or even sometimes also just arrested and things of that nature. But definitely the news media here is constantly telling you how many new murders are going on. And some of these are actually what is called black on black crime. Yeah. And sometimes that is not covered as well. Now,
and also in Briar Creek, where I live, there were two murders that took place. One right down the street from me, and the other one across the street, the Barnes and Noble. Okay, it was white on white crime. But what was the reason? Domestic violence was the reason, Mark. In other words, it's almost like, hey, this is okay. In other words, we're not going to cover that because we'd rather cover an egregious act with a policeman and ignore the domestic violence in this country. There were two of them took place right here in this community, and this is not a downscale community. It was all white people shooting each other.
Nick,
so talk to me why that isn't important.
Nick, think about something. Remember this Marxist communist that I described yesterday in the show? There would not be domestic violence in these circumstances, right?
Yeah, you're right. That's very, very good, Sasha. And Shaquille was totally against it, but I wasn't completely against it. I was going, well, that could work actually at some point in time. But what I'm also saying is the issues like this, the media directs the issue. And I said yesterday on one of these shows, I said the number one issue on CBS tomorrow will be race. And guess what it was? It was a race issue. What was it? George Floyd, redo. Why was it George Floyd redo? Because he sells. I mean, the guy is, it's too bad he's not alive. He'd be a great salesman, great spokesman for the cause right now. But the thing is, then the 54 people that got shot in Chicago, let's ignore that. The two domestic violence here in Briar Creek that was wide on, oh, let's ignore that. Those lives don't matter. Domestic violence lives don't matter, right? And by the way, it was women shooting men. They were both men that were dead. How do you like that one? Okay, well, I mean, you'd think that would be a good byline, but apparently we've accepted domestic violence being, hey, that's okay, and we accept Chicago having 12 people died this weekend, and that's okay too. So I count 14 that don't matter. Okay, and George does matter. I mean,
And ironically, you talk about domestic violence, and from what I understand from friends of mine in the police force, that's actually a major issue, even in the police force as well. So apparently, there's a significantly more amount of domestic violence with people in law enforcement and the military.
You know what Kim did? She created this bracelet that people are supposed to wear after you get what they call a restraining order. Mm-hmm. And what she wants to do, and it makes sense, you put a bracelet that people can't attach on your arm and also the person, the domestic violence. And if they ever come close to each other, their buzzes and alarms are set off. Okay, that's a technological solution to what they call a restraining order. In court, all attorneys know a restraining order, Mark, is a piece of paper and
Right.
it doesn't do anything. Okay, you know how many sales she made on that? 0. Why? Because we're not interested in finding a solution, and not only that, frankly, we don't even care. And I'm going like, okay, but there's not a lot of press on that, and I think that form of restraining order would be a high tech solution to a lot of domestic violence out there, and it gets no love nor attention. So what's wrong with this picture? It's just it's mind-boggling. So there's some very important issues out there that CBS, ABC, and NBC will not address tomorrow. Okay,
Okay.
but what they will address is it's now 1 year and 1 day after George Floyd got shot or got sat on by a police cop. That'll be interesting.
I can now. I've just got an idea that there is only one other individual in all history of mankind who became famous because of just the fact of his death.
Mhm.
So he was really okay. Let's be fair. Just nothing during his lifetime. Okay, that's. And I'm trying not to be very dignified to him. He was just nothing. It's the best what I can say. However, the last 9 minutes of his life changed universe,
Yeah.
cosmos. Everything's became changed. There was everything before he died, and then the universe after he died, and it's
Right.
different universe. And the other man who did the same thing was Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was one of the prophets in Israel at the time. Every second man was a prophet, okay? So he was prophet, and he was talking and talking and talking. It was nothing. Nobody would even remember who he is and what he was and so on. However, that descendants of Golgotha and his death and crucified, and then all what's happened after his death, that made him extremely famous person, at least. Maybe even more. So this is only 2 men that I can think of. So
because
Jesus Christ and George Floyd.
Yeah, it's called martyrdom, and then sainthood follows. By the way, so the thing is, you just got to watch how all this stuff goes. But yeah, I mean, it does. Yeah, the last 9 minutes. And the thing is, it was a brutal, I hate to say it was a brutal execution, caught on tape. And see, here's the other thing that is quite correct. How much of these stuff went on for years that never got caught because we didn't have the cell phones? And it did. It went on for a long time, but there's no way you can prove your case. That's the problem.
Yeah, but we can
So
even
we celebrate not only
Hold on a
George
second.
Floyd, but also a person who took it on camera. Because if he would died and it would not be on camera, nobody would care. Okay, so another guy.
Plus the story. If it wasn't on camera, Sasha, the story would be so different. The police would go, "Well, he was resisting arrest."
Absolutely.
No, wait a second though. But what's
he
the
had a
difference
gun? There was no gun.
Hey, Nick and Sasha, but I do have to ask the question, and I mean, I'm asking this sincerely and everything, but what's the difference between that? Because in some cases, it was law enforcement that it enacted it, if we look at history and everything, between what happened to George Floyd and what happened to Emmett Till and a number of others as well. And then, by the way, Emmett Till is the most known, but there were thousands of lynchings that happened, and there were even entire bombings. There's a map of the places that show African American towns that were bombed in the United States that include Tulsa, Wilmington, and a number of other places. So we actually had folks that were being bombed in their neighborhoods historically, and this has been going on for a while, and there's been other kinds of destruction as well. It doesn't always have to be a physical bomb. It can also be a highway going right through the middle of a town, like what happened here in Durham, North Carolina. So like I said, we can't say that there was just one martyr in the sense of George Floyd, and that it is not part of a systemic and historical issue that is also out there.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Tulsa was another one that they buried it literally under the ground. In other words, it was egregious mark, and they buried it. And then there was another issue in California that just came out. These black people, they own on beachfront property, like on Manhattan Beach, on California. And what happened was the city government decides we want it now. And they took it over through a legal process called eminent domain and gave them pennies for the millions of dollars that it was worth, And so the thing is, there are incidents like that go on, probably even go on today but just doesn't attract a lot of attention. See, the real problem is George was front and center, but the real question is how many of these things go on today that just don't get front and center news. And then even also, I think it was in Elizabeth City here in North Carolina.
Yeah.
Remember they chased this guy down, they shot him like it was okay. Mm-hmm. And in England, from what I understand, in Great Britain, they have a policy. They basically don't shoot you. In other words, the policy isn't, hey, you're running, let's shoot him. Okay. The policy is chase them down and eventually get them, because think about it, Mark. Where's someone going to hide? Between cell phones, credit cards, tracking devices, you can run in this country, but you cannot hide. It's not as bad as Russia, but they will find you eventually. So you don't really need to shoot people if you're trying to serve a warrant on them. Okay,
yeah, they'll eventually find them, because what was the guy?
Yeah, if they run away, they'll catch you.
Because what was the guy in the mountains that they eventually found? And he was actually white, by the way.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah.
Essentially, Nick, you know what police could have done, and it could be very smart if they would do that. Essentially, if you encounter police, especially if there is some kind of conflict involved,
right?
So police basically has to declare that, look, a guy who you are, whatever you are, you're basically dead, because I have a gun and I can shoot you if and when you will resist or you will do all kind of garbage. So essentially you have a chance to be alive if you will comply with everything what I'm going to tell you now. You have a chance to be alive. You're not dead yet. You're still alive, believe it or not. And I'll give you 10 seconds, and you'll tell me you want to be alive or you want to be dead. If you want to be dead, I'll kill you right away.
So it sounds like Sasha.
I'll give you a chance, another 20 seconds to be alive.
So Sasha, it sounds like you want to go back to the Wild Wild West and corral.
That's the Russian way of doing things. They're very effective.
Hold on, that's how America was built.
Hey, speaking about effective overseas. Okay, Sasha, your friend, who's it, Domachenko, or whatever his name is, who's the king of Belarus, I guess. Ryanair. You saw that. You can't make this up. So Ryanair is taking a guy who doesn't like him on an airplane trip from Athens, Greece to Lithuania. Probably Vilnius, Lithuania, but you cross over Belarus airspace. All right. So what Domachenko does, he goes, well, now that I know this guy's flying, how did he even know the guy's on the plane? I don't know. He's going to send fighter jets up to let him know there's a bomb on the plane. There is no bomb, but there's his political enemy. They forced the plane down. It's a Ryanair. It's like a Southwest Airlines. It's the southwest of Europe.
It's
down to land in Minsk. Okay, and then they arrest the guy. And then they tell Ryanair, go ahead and take off. And everybody's sitting there stunned, like, what just happened? There was no bomb scare. That's how they deal with their political opposition in Belarus. And so the European Union and Ryanair are all like, WTF, what's going on? Which is absolutely a good question to the king of Belarus. And I'm not sure how your friend Putin deals with it. Is this Putin's buddy? He's going like, good work, man. That's how you take care of your political opposition here.
Don't forget, Lukashenko, he's playing hockey with Putin. The only thing, Putin is scoring 11 goals and Lukashenko scores 6-7 goals. But still,
Oh, really? So they're hockey buddies? Is that the deal?
Yeah, they're hockey buddies.
Okay, so Putin isn't going to do jack about this. To him, it's business as usual. Political opponent flying over airspace.
Actually, he's very envious of Lukashenko because as there are no flights that are taking flight over Russia. Nobody is crazy enough to fly over Russian territory. But Belarusian territory, it's deemed to be so kind of like
I flew over Russian territory several years ago to get to St. Petersburg. You had to get to St. Petersburg, Russia. Yeah. I may have even flown over Belarus. I don't know. You get on the
guys,
plane to go.
To get back on topic, I know I've got to leave a little early today, but real quickly. So, Sasha, you brought up a really good point. I think we have to know more about the person and what happened, but I think the most important thing is policies that we can incorporate. And the task force that I served on, in my opinion, was a very productive exercise because it had all the cities in our state, and we were able to learn from each other and get really good presentations and come up with different things that cities can do at the local level, addressing redlining, gentrification, business ownership, and having a conversation. Because as Nick Paladiva has mentioned, the press has taken wind of this, and it's just one thing after the other on news show after news show, and we keep talking about the same thing. So I think that this task force is the first step in the right direction of actually getting us to have a conversation on what we can do to make it better. Any thoughts on that, Mark?
Oh, the thing I was going to add to that is, and I actually brought it up in that meeting that you were part of with the Triangle Association of the Broadcast Journalists, and I brought it up in a couple of other places that I've been having the privilege of being at and everything. But one of the things that happens, and it comes back to Nick's point, is that we have these issues that need to be dealt with on a regular basis, and they need to be dealt with concretely. So that fact that you were part of a task force that's trying to come up with concrete solutions is a wonderful idea, because too often what I find we have happening is not that the issues aren't raised, but that we have these shifting winds of issues, meaning that sometimes the issue is raised, and I'll give the example, like the African American community becomes front and center and Black Lives Matter happens, and then something happens in another community, like the Asian community or like the Hispanic community with the Dreamers or with the LGBT community, and then the media shifts its focus away from that Black Lives Matter issue to the other issues, and then the other issues get swept underneath the rug. So that's my issue. And it kind of comes back to Nick's point that if we're going to be having these media conversations, they don't need to be stopping and not being dealt with on a regular basis. Now, they can also drive great conversations that can then have a lot more discussion. That's why I'm a big fan of what the lady did that ran the 1619 Project, because that actually brought history into the modern times, and we're trying to find solutions and things of that nature. And the same with the movie 13th, which actually looked at the prison industrial complex and how its history impacted the way it's run now. So, and if the folks aren't familiar with that, they can go check it out on Netflix and some of the other video platforms. But I think that that's what happens too often, is that we don't have these issues dealt with on a regular basis. And it even comes back to another one of Nick's favorite points as well, which I was actually having the pleasure of being on a conference call yesterday, and we were bringing that up as well, which is that the education system is totally screwed up, and it doesn't want to deal with a lot of these issues on any sort of regular basis. So we need to be teaching things, and a lot of people even agreed with what Nick said about fiscal responsibility, about the financial responsibility, both personally and on other levels, but also deal with history as well, because a lot of times we don't even know our local history, much less our national or our international history. And that's something that I think we need to have working on a regular basis. I mean, I bet you right now that I could go grab some kids from around here in this neighborhood that I live in here in Durham, and I could ask them one about historical figures from Durham, like Merrick and Moore, who were actually some of the founders of Black Wall Street. And I could also ask them about Putin, and on all of them, they would be asking me Putin who and Merrick who, because they would have no clue as to who the heck we were talking about. And we're talking about folks that are either historically known here in Durham in the sense of Merrick and Moore, because they were the creators or some of the creators of Black Wall Street. And we're talking about a modern historical figure in Russia. And I guarantee you, there would be some folks here that would have no clue who the heck I was talking about.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. They wouldn't even know both. Another interesting thing that came in today's news at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, they had the ability to hire a Pulitzer Prize winning author from the New York Times. They went ahead.
That's the one that did the 1619 Project, right?
The 1619 Project, right. So here, UNC Chapel Hill. Now here you'll love it, Mark. Traditionally, they grant them a salary plus tenure when they come in.
Right.
The Board of Trustees decide to grant the salary but no tenure. Oh, the faculty went crazy, and so did and rightfully so, because here's the real problem: whether UNC Chapel Hill likes it or not, they have an It's hard to recruit somebody who's really, famous and good, like a Pulitzer Prize winner, to be a teacher. They had the opportunity to do that. And then all of a sudden, they kind of slapped her in the face And I was going like, boy, that was bad. So it made the front page news of the News Observer, which I thought was pretty interesting. So,
for some now, and yes, you're right. It has definitely raised the ire of a lot of people around the country and around definitely this area, because folks from the faculty, the other folks are trying to figure out why he did not receive that tenure when it's been a historical factor that usually folks that get that position automatically get tenure based on the job and everything. And of course, like you said, this is a historical person that's going to be teaching that course starting actually in July, so in about a month and a half and all of that, but they do not want to give tenure. So yeah, there's some folks, including I know some of the past faculty, and actually my dad is a past faculty member at the School of Journalism, so I have not talked to him about that, but I'm sure that he would also be quite upset as well. So I need to find out what his thoughts are about that, but he definitely taught there for a number of years, and definitely there were some other folks that I'm in touch with that are part of that program as well. So maybe I'll try to get Trevi or some of those on our show in the near future.
Okay. Yeah, it looks like Jay Glasgow has just joined us from the Privacy Co-op, which is an interesting issue in of itself. In other words, people's privacy being taken over. Hey, speaking of privacy and taken over, Amazon announced a purchase of MGM Studios today. So they're which one of our prediction is the big tech is just going to take over the media. I mean, they have the money, they have the power, they have the resources. So they're going to take over your lives. They're going to take over the media. And frankly, Jay, there's nothing you can do. I think what we need to do is just surrender. Hey, look, they took our URL. We were IBM TV, and IBM says it's mine now. Gulp. You know, I was kind of like, any compensation? No.
Yeah.
You know, you get any notice? Well, you get like 10 days, and all of a sudden, hey, it's mine now. And then you find out this. This is really funny. WIPO, which is the World Intellectual Property Organization, the company that does all their manufacturing of all those URLs is none other than IBM. So the thing is, it's almost like they're the judge and the executioner.
Nick, may I ask you a question? Can you say that what big tech does with media companies is the same thing what Israel does with Palestinians?
Yeah, right. Well, basically, that's true. Let's take them
Wow.
out.
No, come on now. That's I don't think that's a fair equation at all.
It goes back to the number one rule of this life: might makes right. So the thing is, and history is written by the winners, not the losers. No one in the United States says George Washington was a slave-owning trader. Oh, even though it would be true. Okay. Yeah, and the thing is, it would also be true, possibly this. The reason for the Revolutionary War wasn't the tea. It's that Great Britain was eliminating slavery, and the United States was not.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Pretty good. Yeah, we can hear you loud.
Okay.
I do have a question for Sasha.
I think I studied a totally different textbook than that, but
the thing is,
and I'm sure you did. And I do want to get to you, Jay, but I did have a question for Sasha. It was based on an article that I read, which was actually quite interesting. And the article was pointing out the fact, and speaking of newspapers, it was actually in the New York Times, I believe, yesterday. But it was pointing out the fact that and it kind of came to a point that I made yesterday, which is that historically speaking, the U.S. and other allies kind of propped up Israel in the sense of giving them a lot of aid and everything during their early development stage and even into this time. As a matter of fact, I think it said that at one point it was like 10% of Israel's money that they were getting was coming from the United States. It's now down to, even though it's I think 40 billion, it's still like only 1%. So it's
I rather than take on the revisionist history that I'm hearing, and there's quite a bit. I would say that you guys need to go back and look at the United Nations votes on establishing Israel. It wasn't just the United States and a handful of allies.
I wasn't saying it was just the United States.
It was the entire world. It was the entire world. But rather than get mired down in international politics, I'd like to maybe address from a technical privacy issue some of the questions that came up as I was joining the show today. If you're talking about Nicole Hannah-Jones, I'm excited that we are now starting to turn some of these conversations into non-binary conversations. Just a handful of months ago, if I had proposed to, potentially even this group of people on this TV show, that if somebody used influential power to publish a series of conservative articles and then got a professorship and a social media campaign was launched against them, should they be denied tenure, I would hazard to guess that there would be a number of people on this panel that might even applaud that. So I'm very thankful that we're starting to get past the binary side of this conversation and get to what's wrong is wrong, right? And so you see the cancel culture, I think, gasping its last breath in some of these things, as you see with not just with Hannah Jones. We need to look at Emily Wilder as well, of the AP, that was totally fired for some tweets that she put out when she was in college. And then, CNN's Brian Stelter now saying that the tweet of one person doesn't represent an entire group of people. For a second there, I thought hell was freezing over when I heard him say that, but I'm very excited to hear him say that, right? And then we have Perry Bacon of the Washington Post coming out on a very long diatribe about how we need to stop looking at what people are saying on social media to determine the character of, the content of their character. I was very excited to see this non-binary approach to the cancel culture. So I'm an optimist here, Nick. I think that cancel culture is seeing its waning breath as we're starting to see now from both sides of the aisle in the United States this total cancellation of the cancel culture, because they're starting to realize that these weapons can be used to silence anybody, and that's wrong.
And I would agree with you to some degree, but I would ask this question: if you're saying that cancel culture is being canceled on both sides fairly, and the reason I'm going to bring this question up and everything is I was just, like I said, I've been on a couple of conference calls, and one of them dealt with race relations and things along that line. And one of the points that was brought up, and it actually involved North Carolina to some degree as well, is that if we eliminate the teaching of critical race theory, can we truly have the teaching of even American history? Because a lot of that deals with critical race theory.
Well, actually, I beg to differ you. I'm going to differ with you, but not on your main point, right? I will say that critical race theory is like the 13th chapter of Karl Marx's book, and it's the exact name that he coined, and it's exactly the chapter that he wrote. But beyond that, rather than talk about the origins of critical race theory, I'm going to agree with you on a very powerful point you just said, Mark, which is we should not be canceling any free speech. If somebody wants to preach critical race theory, even in the schools, they should be allowed to do that. But at the same time, all other viewpoints should have the flexibility to do likewise, right? And we certainly shouldn't be silencing people. The right solution to free speech is not condemnation and silencing. The right solution is more free speech, right? So we want to promote that. We want to promote all viewpoints. But, that's not happening today in today's campuses. We've moved from a world where it was tilted one way. Now we're tilted another way. But society will correct itself as long as it's allowed to. But if we have conservative governors out there that are saying that we're going to prohibit teaching a particular subject or you're going to get your funds. And by the way, I'm going to say, as a caveat, Nick, as long as it doesn't rise to the level of like the Brandenburg test, or as long as it's age appropriate for the kids, right? As long as it's appropriate content. And I don't want to be the arbiter of what's appropriate. I'm saying we all know what we mean. What was that famous, there was a Supreme Court case where the justice said about pornography, I don't know that I can define it, but I know it when I see it.
Right.
Let's just use that litmus test and say as long as it's appropriate for the children, well, I don't think any idea should be off the table for discussion in schools.
Just a question I'm asking, and I don't know the answer, but I know one of the ladies that was on the panel, her husband actually teaches at Villanova University and, is a proponent to some degree of some of the thought patterns of Malcolm X and the Black Panthers and some of the Stokely Carmichael, some of those that might have been the more radical elements of the 60s movement and all of that. Can you really teach a course on Black history and definitely their philosophy if you can't teach critical race theory, because part
No.
of their theory was critical race theory.
Yeah, you can certainly and you can certainly teach what critical race theory is. I don't think it should be prohibited, but you should also be able to teach all other viewpoints as well. That shouldn't be the only viewpoint that's presented, right? And I think that's a concern.
But also, Jay, one of the important things I see, it's not just what you're teaching, is how big is your megaphone that you're teaching from. In other words, free speech also, you got to look at the size of the megaphone. Let's imagine you're in Homer, Alaska, and you're preaching to somebody. No one's going to hear you, so who cares? But let's imagine you're the president of the United States. You have a big megaphone. You go, Bart, and everybody hears you. So let's say you're with CBS. CBS has a big megaphone in the United States. Bart. Now, as we go internationally, we find out CBS, I've had a lot of countries say, who are they? I mean, it's all of a sudden like, wow, you guys don't know our leading, our top level viewer watch here in CBS, but in a lot of countries we go to, they don't even know who they are. So really, it's not just the freedom of speech; it's how big is your megaphone.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment. I totally agree with you, Nick, that the size of the megaphone matters. So you're hearing it first on World Edition.
Thank you.
Size matters.
Size matters.
But it is not the end all and be all of everything. Let me clarify. We're going to do a show tonight on Private Eye. That's Private Eye. Everybody tune in to tonight's show, and we're going to talk about people with very large megaphones, larger than the president's, right? The members of FANG, that's Facebook and Amazon and Apple and Netflix and Google, have a larger megaphone than even the president of the United States. And they have used that megaphone and that power to squash very large competitors. And when they did that, intended or otherwise, they also squashed hundreds or thousands of small businesses. We're actually going to interview an owner of one of those small businesses that was crushed out of existence when Parler was deplatformed. We're going to talk to them on tonight's show, and then we're going to talk to a legal expert about what the harms are to those small businesses, and then ultimately the remedy. So back to your conversation you were having just a moment ago. If one large fish gobbles up another large fish, is that so big that we can't take it on? And we're actually going to give an illustration of a very large spider attacking an ant, and that large spider can totally demolish an ant. But you know what happens when 100 ants gang up on that large spider? The ants win.
The ants win, right.
The bottom line is that everybody watching us right now owns the rights to the information that they generate. And we're going to show on tonight's show how you can unlock those rights and even take on these very, very large megaphones because you're stronger. Every single person watching this, their rights are actually stronger than the person holding that big giant megaphone.
Yeah, and you know, there's two social media sites, Free Speech and something else that are social media sites on Facebook that we rebroadcast these, Jay. And the thing is, they love what you're doing. And they have good followings. They have like 77,000 and 22,000. So it's about 100,000 people on those two sites. It's free. You go to Facebook, type in free speech, you'll see it. Okay, there's a very huge free speech association group on Facebook right now.
You know, in very large groups on Facebook, I don't know if you paid attention, last week at this juncture on Wednesday, last week, did you guys know that one of the largest groups on Facebook, but the largest Christian group on Facebook, it was called the Jerusalem Prayer Team. They were deleted by Facebook. 77 million followers.
Yeah.
77 million followers deleted. Do you know what the reason that was given by Facebook?
Why?
They cited a policy that they had disingenuous posts.
Yeah.
Now, what is a disingenuous post? I don't even know what that means.
Whatever Mark Zuckerberg says it is.
Yeah, but
that's what it is.
But here's what really happened. This group had enemies, right? And this group had enemies, and that's fine. Every group has enemies these days. The enemies designed a concerted effort. They posted 1 million different posts that were derogatory towards the people that they were praying for. And then they said to Facebook, I didn't post that. This team hacked my account and posted it for me. So just kind of following the logic here, a bunch of Christians became techno hackers. They hacked 1 million accounts, posted derogatory posts against Jerusalem and then pretended that it was their enemies. Now that's something Tom Clancy can't even figure out, right? I mean, that's the most ridiculous thing. But Facebook said, we think those posts were disingenuous, so we're deleting the group. Not the people that posted them. We're going to delete the group because these posts were disingenuous. So if you think that you're beyond big tech's reach, you're not. Every group is. It doesn't matter whether you're conservative or Democrat, Republican or Democrat or conservative or progressive. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on. We have to understand that these companies are big, giant spiders. We're tiny little ants, but when we band together with our information rights, we are greater than they. And we need to start addressing that, and we need to start coming together as brothers and sisters and say, hey, we need to take control of this. And the fastest way is to opt out. The fastest way is to opt out.
Wow, 77 million is a big demographic, by the way.
That's a huge number.
That's a very big demographic.
I was checking that. Yeah. Yeah, go on.
It was the day after that we did our show on data genocide, and we caught a lot of flack for that show. We had people saying, "Come on, this isn't a genocide," and the next day, Facebook said, "Oh yes, it is." It was just like amazing.
Hey, Nick, you'll get a kick out of this. And by the way, I was looking at the folks that were giving us thumbs up, and definitely saw that Ankit had given us thumbs up. But actually, was going to bring up something that he would find interesting, and it is dealing with world politics and everything. But I was actually talking to some filmmaker friends of mine from around the country, and I would actually argue around the world. And they were trying to talk to a Indian filmmaker, and he was trying to figure out how he could expand his market and everything. So one of the things that they were suggesting was that they kind of, I won't say dummy it down, but they kind of like try to make it appealable, meaning the Bollywood films, to like American audiences and other audiences, which after having watched this show and us having several conversations around filmmaking, actually found somewhat hilarious, because I'm sitting there going like, wait a minute, they've already captivated many billions of an audience with their own type of filmmaking in their own markets. But this person was actually suggesting that they kind of like, refine their filmmaking in order to make it more appealing to our audience, because sometimes
Mark, if you think about it, it's the ultimate scale. In other words, like for years, software was scaled because you can actually develop one computer program, and then once you got the program, you can sell it all over the world. If you look at media, it's the same thing. So Jay does his one program, although Jay's doing more than one program on privacy. But let's say he does one program. You can actually take this program, provided it's evergreen, most of his content is, and then you can distribute to all these Facebook groups, all these LinkedIn groups, all these places around the world. And what I've watched is most of them actually take our content, because remember, the guy who heads up the group, they can accept or deny. Every now and then I get denials, and when I get the denial and I get too many of them, I do with the Facebook group, I delete them. I go, they're obviously not taking our content. There's no reason for me to harass them. But when they do take the content, then I keep sending them more and more content, because a lot of these Facebook groups, what they don't have is they don't have a lot of content. Same thing with the movie makers you're describing. Once they make a movie in India, you can distribute in Australia, you can distribute in New Zealand, you can distribute in South Africa. It's distributed worldwide today. And what's the problem is, if you look at the demographics on distribution on social media versus traditional distribution, when he tells me 77 million, that's a number bigger than CBS's entire audience in the United States. It's really, really sad. And the sad part is they needed to capture and isolate and move those 77 million before Facebook did. In other words, capture the data. And I know Jay goes, you don't want to capture data. Yeah, if you're on this side of the aisle, you do want to capture the data. Okay.
No, I agree with you, Nick. What we're seeing is there is a grassroots movement, and it actually came out of the progressive side of the house. Baratun Thurston, he's a progressive spokesperson, comedian, educator. He's got a great TED Talk on race relations. He actually had one of the largest followings on Twitter and also on Instagram. What he did was, and this has been a couple of years ago, because he and I are friends, he actually moved his entire audience to an SMS network. So basically, people are building a network, a social network on their phone, and they only communicate out to their followers directly, right? So nobody can shut them off.
There's that's basically what Rogan did as well. Joe Rogan definitely moved away and created his own thing, and has definitely had a tremendous amount of success with his own kind of creating his own network, as you just put it, with that other gentleman.
Yep. Baritone Thurston. If you haven't heard of him, I'd recommend looking him up. He's got some really great stuff out there. He and I don't agree politically on a few things, but other than that, he's a great guy and a great thinker.
And that's what it's all about, is great thinking and all that. That actually came back to the point that I was making. You called it revisionist history, but what I was getting ready to say, and I was curious to know Sasha's thought on this, what I was saying about Israel, was that in the early days of the history, it definitely was reliant on a lot of American aid, but and other world powers as well. But now they have become more independent. So it even comes back to like what we're talking about with independence, of having your own power, your own control. So they've become more independent. So what the article we yesterday was saying in the New York Times was that is actually diminished the U.S.'s influence on them, because they actually have it's that case of actually being in control of their own narrative. So that's something that a lot of people would like to be in control of, is their own narrative.
Interesting what Steve you said yesterday. I don't know if Steve still with us or not. Anyway, he said yesterday something to the effect that he was. Steve, could you remind what you said yesterday from Fareed Zakaria about Israel? What was that?
Oh, what Fareed Zakaria was saying about Israel?
Yes.
He basically said, so the thing with Fareed Zakaria is that he just reminded everybody that Israel is just has emerged as the superpower of the Middle East.
Basically, that's what I'm saying.
And so that from a technology, from just the dominance, 5% of the GDP on research and development, AI, all the technology, and also the nuclear missiles, 100 nuclear warheads. So but the fact that they're dominant, what his theory was that they're in a position of strength where they don't really, hardline government doesn't really have to work anything out with Palestine. But his theory at the end was that there are a lot of people that like the Palestinians to live in peace, and that it just requires the country to say, we want this, and they just have a two-state solution. So
Steve, there is something else. I think you said yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned that the GDP of Israel is one of top 10 or 12 in the world. The country has no debts. And the country has...
no debts,
Hold on. And the country has close to $1 trillion of national reserves. That makes Israel one of the most powerful economics in the world.
So is that a good thing, Sasha? Sasha, I got a question for you. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is that good or bad?
And before you answer that, Sasha,
it's the second question. The first section is to accept the fact. If it's
I totally accept it. My question is that good or bad? Because I had a really great financial advisor recently talk to me, and I asked him a question. This is a shocking question to ask, but I said, do you have Jewish people that you work for? And he said, yes, I do. And I said, do you have Christian people that you work for? And he said, yes. I said, which one are more wealthy, the Jewish customers that you service or the Christian customers? And he said 10-1 Jews are more wealthy than my Christian customers. And I said, why is that? And he said, well, because Christians ignore the Old Testament, and the Old Testament is where all of the philosophy around good financial investments and good financial growth are kept. Now that's an interesting point to make, right? Is that if you have a textbook that tells you how to invest wisely and how to make money, and you read it and then you apply its principles, does that make you a bad person or a good person? I think it makes you a wise person.
Absolutely.
But if you also could read that book and you say, I'm going to choose not to read that book, and I'm not going to learn those principles, and I'm going to go try to do this on my own, and you don't do as well, does that make you a good person or a bad person? I don't think it makes you. I think it makes you an unwise person, right? So this is a wisdom question, not a good versus bad.
You got it right, and I think it's an old saying. I think I remember Bill Clinton what he said, it's economy stupid. So
Yes, the economy's stupid.
Okay, I just pulled Israel. The fact is they're sitting at number 30. The GDP nominal is 383 billion. Now, if you think about 383 billion, a lot of money, right? No, because Joe Biden's going to spend that 4 times over, and
But they
then
have about
some,
180 billion of
and
cash
then
reserves,
some.
I think. I think
Okay,
they have
so
180
how
billion of
much?
cash.
How much?
yeah, just on
180
his,
billion.
just on
Hey,
his.
Yeah, but
you
think
know,
about it. It's a small country of only 8, maybe 9
9 million.
million
9
people.
million. 9
Yeah,
million.
but it's equal to Norway. In other words, they're right below Norway and right ahead of the Philippines. So Norway is right in line with Israel in
So,
terms of their
Nick,
GDP.
that's what I was asking because the article was
Yeah.
saying that Israel's decade-long economic boom had basically left the country less and less reliant. So that's where I was
Well,
coming back with
the
the
thing
military
is,
stuff.
There's something else what Farid Zakaria says.
Yeah.
You know what did he say? He said that if the Six-Day War of 1967 would be waged today, it would have been 6 hours war, not
Yeah.
6 days
Well,
war.
because they were smart, Mark. They're not relying on the United States, who we know our political winds change here. So
Right.
could you imagine you rely on the U.S. and our political winds for whatever reason say we don't really care, and all of a sudden they're overrun. So that most countries realize today the United States is fickle when it comes to their foreign policy. You can't rely on us.
And
So
that was kind of the point I was
that's
making
what they
because
did.
they
Of
were
course.
saying that in 1981, American aid was equivalent to almost 10% of Israel's economy, and in 2020, which was last year, it was nearly $4 billion, which was closer to 1%.
You know, Israel is a technical powerhouse. They do a really good job. Israeli corporations do a really good job with data privacy. We've researched this in pretty in depth. I've done some work with their big data centers and incubators there. Top notch folks. But this isn't something new. In 1995, when I worked for AT&T, I actually was trained by an Israeli firm on how to do quality assurance testing the IBM way. So this is back in the days of the old Quality Academy from IBM. So they were dialed into this tech echelon a long time ago. This has been going on for decades. You plug in early, you get rewarded.
Do you know IBM TV could stand for Israel Broadcasting Corporation TV?
Yeah, but you can't use IBM as 3 letters in anything combined. You have to get that's owned by IBM.
I don't know. When I was 2 years old, I told my mom those 3 letters every single day, and she would smile and applaud.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, I'm just letting you know the internet has new rules.
I got it, Jake.
Thank you, Mark. I'm glad somebody did.
Stephen, final thing about Farid Zakaria, which after you mentioned that, I was quite impressed, and I was listening to his.
Yeah, he's really impressive. I listened to him.
Why is he on our show? Why don't you invite him on our show?
I don't know how you get a hold of him.
They all have websites and feeds and handles today. You just contact
Yeah,
them.
we'd love to. Maybe we'll reach out to him. But we're going to close out the show. I got to leave for another meeting, but want to thank everyone for being with us today. We're going to have another conversation. I will not be here tomorrow. I've got to travel. Mark Lee will be running the show. I'll be back on Thursday, but we've got I want to thank Pod TV for an exciting show. And wherever you are, my closing argument is the George Floyd call to action. Just Google the NAACP. There's a bunch of virtual events going on, ways that you can get involved. But as a policymaker, I would say have a conversation in your local community about what we can do to have a conversation, more than just a protest and rally. But what can we do to have a better healing in America? But on that note,
use the free tools on privacy.coop for reporting wrongful police profiling. We've got to start doing that.
We've got to start doing that. Thank you so much, folks. And may the light and love of our hearts always lift us out of the darkness. Thank you, and we'll be back tomorrow, but I will see you on Thursday morning.
All right.
Might be in a little bit tomorrow. Thank you so much. Namaste.